In case you missed the first video in this series, I'm 3D printing a life-size R2-D2. In that video, I talked about making the dome, including printing, gluing, finishing, and painting it. It turned out really well, if I do say so myself, and that gave me the confidence to continue making the rest of the body. If you haven't seen the first video, I would really recommend you watch it first because I explained some things about this project, but I should warn you first of all that this one won't be as impressive as the first video. Not only is the next section I'm working on primarily a hidden support structure, I also ran into a number of issues that ended up delaying my progress, and that's part of the reason it's taken so long to make this second video. Today I'm going to be talking about the frame, which serves as R2's skeleton that everything else attaches to. The designs posted on Thingiverse, which you can find a link to in the video description, were made by user Mrbaddeley, but the frame in particular was based very heavily off of a frame made by YouTuber James Bruton for this very cool 3D printed R6 droid. His version was pretty much skeletal though, so you can see that there was a lot of work involved in making a full R2-D2 out of this. I highly recommend you check out his channel if you're interested in this kind of thing, by the way. He's so far beyond me in terms of skill, it's kind of laughable. But let's talk about the frame, shall we? Once it's finished, it'll be covered in a skin like this. But that's not going to be done until sometime down the road. Right now, we're just concerned with the inner frame inside. It's made up of lots and lots of thin slats of 3D printed material that are joined together for strength. This is a good design, but it was a bit of a problem for me because it turns out I wasn't able to print long, flat objects without them warping noticeably. For a long time, I just put blue painter's tape onto my print bed and printed onto that. It seemed to work fine for most models, but things like these thin, flat pieces ended up warping even when using a raft. That's a separate disposable piece of plastic that you print before the actual model, and it helps prevent warping and shifting of the model in many cases. Unfortunately, I didn't realize how bad the issue with the warping was until I had printed most of the pieces for the frame. I later discovered that a combination of Dremel's build sheets, which they sell separately, covered in a thin layer of glue stick, made the models really stick well without any warping, and I'll be using this for the remainder of the build. I guess I should be glad I figured this out when I did, since this section I'm doing now won't be visible, but later ones would be totally ruined if they warped this much. Here are a couple of the supports. It may not be immediately obvious, but the pieces don't fit together tightly as they should. Especially on the back, you can tell that there's a gap of a millimeter or two between the pieces, and this is a big deal when you've got tight tolerances like we have on this model. This other one isn't glued together yet, so you can see how they fit together and overlap to make the supports stronger than they would be otherwise. Warping was also a problem with the pieces making up the horizontal rings. Here is the frame partially assembled. You can see how the ends of these supports in particular have gaps in the middle, and that makes them bigger than they should be. That makes them not fit into the slots in the frame, so I had to use a rotary tool to make them bigger, and that's not really easy. I ended up having to scrap and reprint the bottom ring because it would warp so badly. Luckily, the skirt, which attaches to the bottom of the frame, wasn't really affected by the warping because these parts are so thick. Since this is the only part of the part I'm doing now that will be visible, I did have to sand it, and these parts that stick out here made that a little bit challenging. I mentioned some other problems that delayed my progress, so let me touch on those before I show you the finished frame. When I was testing out a way to avoid warping, I must have had my settings wrong because the model ended up sliding off the bed partway through, and after that the plastic just started attaching itself around the nozzle, forming a large cloud that was impossible to remove. I didn't get a great picture of it, but you can sort of see it here. The burn mark is where I attempted to use a lighter to melt the part that had covered the screw that would allow me to remove the extruder unit. Pro tip, don't do this. I was eventually able to remove the unit and replace it, and got back to printing. I also ended up killing one sander and one rotary tool. And finally, here is the finished frame. While I did have some issues fitting it together, it's pretty sturdy now, and I think it'll probably work fine. It's actually pretty heavy, especially for a 3D printed object. The top ring here spins and even has a space where you can insert ball bearings to help the head turn smoothly. Unfortunately, the warping made it so that the bearings don't roll quite right, and I think I'll probably just have to leave them out. Since my R2 will not be a motorized version, though, I think it won't be an issue. Over here on the side are some plates where the legs will be attaching. Here you can see some of the issues with the fit, but since this will be covered when everything is done, it doesn't really matter all that much. I still have to paint the skirt on the bottom, but I plan to wait and do that toward the end when I have the skins ready to go. Here's the dome in place. I'm working on the legs now and already have made a fair amount of progress, so my next update shouldn't be quite as long this time, but now that I know how long things take, I definitely won't be finishing R2 until next year sometime. This is especially true because I live in an area with relatively cold winters, and I don't want to be trying to spray paint in sub-zero weather. But I'm going to keep working on it, and you can look forward to more updates in the future. Thanks for watching!